Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Feminist City, and it's a podcast series hosted by Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, where we discuss urban planning, exclusion, the big, the small, and the mundane details that go into making the city. I have here with me Dr. Saryu Natarajan from Apti Institute, and I'm really excited to have her as a guest. Dr. Natarajan has a PhD in political science from King's College London, a master's in public policy, and she's also a lawyer. She has a background in management consulting, venture investing, program management, and development, and is currently working at Apti in policy research at the intersections of technology and society. Hi, Saryu. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So, what I would like to do is talk to you a little bit about the work that you did during your PhD. If I understand correctly, your work had involved researching migrants in Bangalore. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. Of course. So my work was a little bit about migration, but I specifically looked at political behavior in the context of housing. And it's impossible to think about housing in urban areas without sort of grappling with the question of migration, as it's very central. So that is very central to the way urban areas grow, and it's very intimately linked to the quest for housing for many in urban areas. So I think that the two sort of tie into each other very much. So what I looked at specifically was the way in which the urban poor navigate the state and the role of political intermediaries in enabling this kind of access. But more widely, I was able to look at some of the struggles of migrant communities, because fieldwork was in two communities that were mostly migrants. Some of the struggles of the migrant communities in participating in urban areas, in being able to access a range of sort of governance, both services and, participate in a certain way in state making and city making at the in urban areas. The gender aspect of this, and I think we should come back to this in the course of this conversation. The big struggle is, of course, the visibility of the issue itself, and very often, and I think you alluded to it in one of the earlier conversations we had as well, which is that the imagination of the migrant is very often male and very often young male.
That's what I was actually just going to come to it. Primarily to understand, I think we all talk about migrant labor, and we see migrant labor even in our communities when it's like the city wouldn't work without them. But I think there is very little understanding of what specific challenges they face. And also this assumption, when we think of the migrant worker, it is a young, able-bodied male. So what I wanted to, my next question was essentially going to be about that. What are the challenges that migrant workers who come into Bangalore face in negotiating access to services, and how do they go about it? And what specifically do women face?
Right. You're absolutely right. I think the experience is very differentiated by gender for sure, but it's also differentiated by where migrants come from. So migrants who come from parts of the country that are closer to the destination of migration have a very different experience than ones that come from further away. And I think a lot of that then goes into patterns by which the state is accessed, by which a range of private services is accessed, by the way in which housing is accessed. So it brings about a lot of variation and differentiation in this kind of work. And I think that that's where, one must be very thoughtful about understanding this in a very specific way. I think just to talk about some of the specifics of, different experiences, the imagination, like you pointed out, is very much that of a young, able-bodied male who comes, and there's a certain sort of romanticization of the distance, the journey, and all of that. And then there's a range of other migrants who come in for a variety of other works. There is sort of the circular migration of individuals who come in from across the border. And Bangalore, speaking specifically of Bangalore, is very much located near, two states, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, and you have migrants who come in from across these states as well. Women experience a certain amount of, women have a gendered experience of that city, and women migrants definitely do, overlaid with the other disadvantages or other concerns around not being familiar with the language, not being familiar with the destination of migration. There's also, of course, the gendered aspect. And one example which is often discussed is, for example, in the context of housing. Women experience a lot of struggle in being able to find safe and secure housing. And if you see see the woman migrant as having migrated for work, though female migration is much more complex than just labor-based migration. You would hear of a range of stories and a range of experiences around difficulties in accessing the city, accessing safe, secure housing where there's proper access to sanitation, and of course, sort of the elements of physical security. So I think that that's an important aspect in the way in which female migrants navigate the city. And then with all of this, one must take an intersectional approach. And if you think about sort of the challenges and what multiplies some of the challenges in accessing urban spaces, participating in governance more broadly, you have to think about the various categories or the various identities one inhabits in being an urban migrant, in addition to, so of course, the category of just being an urban migrant. So I don't know if that was a complex answer, but I think that it is very much an interplay of sort of different concerns that mediates how one accesses the city.
No, absolutely. Thank you. That was actually very illuminating. What I was curious about to understand, if you could talk to me, is sort of what are the chief challenges in that if there is a woman migrant worker who's coming from a neighboring state, how do they go about accessing housing at all in Bangalore? In the sense, do they usually come into the city with people that they already know in the city? Or how is it that they actually manage to secure housing in the first place? Do you think that you could tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So this question, I guess, relates to the specific category of female migrants who come in for work. But the predominant story, and a fair lot of it is invisible, and there's also not more recent data about this, is that female migration is primarily marriage driven, and it's inter-district migration in the sense that women migrate because they are married and then enter the labor force, which is a completely different conversation in accessing urban areas because it's very much mediated through your family or through sort of, and there's of course a patriarchal lens in this as well, but it's mediated through the family, right? So you migrate in order to get married. And then there might be labor force participation post that, but that's a different set of concerns because you don't have to navigate the question of housing. What is emerging, and again, this is a challenge of the space, and I'd love to learn if there are sort of different views or more available data on this, but we know very little about female migration for work, and this typically is linked to a few industries where female participation of the workforce is more gendered or rather more dominated by women. And I think that this is a fairly small segment but growing one as well. So the challenges are very much dependent on the way in which women have to navigate the city in general, but overlaid by the fact that there are often no social connections.
Got it.
In general, again, this goes back to the point, and not to belabor it at all, but maybe one should. But the imagination of migration is also of a young able-bodied man, which means that even the literature talks about this kind of migration, which is generally driven by, it's called a bridgehead. So an individual would migrate to the urban area and then bring in more sort of members from the community into the city to work here. So both the job and access to the city is mediated through this bridgehead. We don't have a wide range of empirical evidence about female migration. But having said that, I think it's something that is starting to get onto people's research agendas. There's a whole lot of scholars who are thinking about gender and migration and participation in platform work. So it's very much at that intersection, but there is a certain invisibility. And I think that that's something to think about. And I think the other sort of point I'd like to make here is that female work, right, is so it's invisible for two reasons. One is it's work by women. And the second is that it's very often work that's performed in private spaces, and it's not often visible or apparent, with the exception of a few professions. And I think that also in some ways plays into the imagination of what a female migrant is. So I think, I guess the answer is I can answer your question, but only in part. But what I'd like to do is to point out the fact that there is a need for much more empirical evidence on this question.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I understand that. I'm going to come to that a little bit in terms of why is there the problems with the lack of data and empirical evidence about this. But I was just curious because as you talked about it, women is, as you said, the dominant pattern of migration is often through marriage, right? As inter-district migration, as you mentioned. So what about children of migrants who come into the city? In the sense, do they often travel? What happens with childcare when there is a lack of secure housing? In a sense, in your research, did you come across how these communities manage this in this context?
I don't have direct empirical evidence, but I do have anecdotal data. I think what I did observe in the community was that it's very much, driven by the community. There's a whole lot of, particularly in the context of the Contract Labor Regulation Act and certain legislations on hiring migrant workers, there's very much the provision that large employers need to provide for creches and childcare. So that dimension is attended to. At least some imagination for this exists in the policy framework. But having said that, I think the implementation of what exists on the ground is very much a far cry. It's very much driven by communities. So you'd have, at least what I observed in the sites that I did my fieldwork in, was that you'd have women taking care of multiple children sometimes. So it's very much a community activity. But I do think that there is a genuine concern here, because you don't have any sort of safe, secure childcare. It's often you have transition schools, or like schools for, like they call bridge schools, I think, for children of migrant workers to enter local schools. And you need that because of the language, medium of instruction, all of those concerns around sort of migrating from one place to the other. But on the ground, there's a huge variation in where and what and how this is enacted. But, this is, I guess it's anecdata that I have from my work in Bangalore.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think the next question that I think I have is about the institutional response itself. As I think we've talked about the ways in which different migrant workers, or even there are different migration patterns, right? How do institutions in Bangalore respond to the needs of these communities? In a sense, what is there? Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because in talking about how do we approach them in terms of provision of services, and in this context, is there any special attention given to women migrant workers or women who are migrating into Bangalore? Is there that imagination itself at that level in terms of their policies or decision making?
Right. I think in order to answer or begin answering that question, one must think about the political economy question here. And this is something that's talked about fairly in the literature, but one of the big challenges in thinking about institutional responses is that institutions don't necessarily have the political incentive to care, right? So migrants, particularly those that come from other states, experience huge barriers in being registered to vote. And in the absence of having a vote, being able to find avenues for expression in the policy sense is a bit constrained. So why would, for example, and this sounds horrid, but why would a rational, self-interested politician who cares about the next election pay too much heed to migrants, right? Whether it's, male able-bodied migrants or sort of wider range of experiences in the context of migration. So I think that is something that must be a framing thought in unpacking migrants' access to urban areas and female migrants' access to urban areas. And I think so that's the first sort of leg of the problem. The second, of course, is a certain invisibility around the way in which migration happens and the way in which female migrants especially do their work in urban areas. So a lot of female work is typically domestic work. It's in garment industry, so there is a certain visibility there. More recently, in the context of platform economy work, which is like home services, like salon therapy, those kinds of services are also performed in homes. So they're not visible in the physical, corporeal sense. So there's a certain invisibility on that. And then there's broadly challenges around data because, as you might know, in the context of the recent conversations around migration and the pandemic, the state kind of suggested that there isn't enough data for us to have a meaningful policy response in this context. So I think just being aware that it's both a political economy and a visibility/data problem is very important in thinking about, what's wrong or what mediates access. Why do migrants struggle? Both these reasons are relevant in thinking about this. And of course, the other sort of tropes that exist and they pop up, this may not necessarily have to do with specific responses at any point of time, but rather are issues in the context of elections, like migrants are taking away jobs or, some kind of language configuration. So those are other kind of issues that also exist in the context of migration. And this is gendered because women additionally need to navigate, just being women over and above all of these issues. So I think that's something to think about in the context of migration here.
Yeah, I mean, this actually brought me to two questions about this. One is in terms of the visibility itself. I think one thing that happened during the pandemic is also a hyper visibility on migrant workers, right? In a sense, we saw images of migrant workers literally walking back to their homes. And do you think that this kind of awareness of this state of affairs causing any change in the responses, and what should ideally be, what is a good institutional response in your opinion in terms of in catering to the services and needs of migrant workers in Bangalore? Second is the question I think I wanted to I would love to hear what you think is in terms of not just internal migrants but external migrants, because I think the narrative in the last year has been also about Bangladeshi immigrants who are taking away jobs from the country, right? There was a particular type of storytelling or narrative around that, and in the way in which there are people from certain communities in Bangalore who are also been targeted by the police. And so I was just curious about how does this affect the women in these communities, in the sense, because I think when we think about Bangladeshi workers, I don't know how many people imagine, a woman who is trying to take care of her children and working in a particular area in Bangalore. So yeah, I'd love to know.
Right. Both those questions are incredibly interesting and terribly hard to answer. So I'll try. I'll try to answer the second question first. I think the question of internal migrants versus external migrants, I think the additional challenge or the additional sort of concern with respect to external migrants is this layering of the political discourse, which brings about a paradoxical sort of hypervisibility with an unwillingness in a certain way to respond to some of the very visible concerns that these communities experience. So I think that's one big challenge. I don't know so much about external migrants in the sense that my work didn't necessarily engage with, one wouldn't know either, with migrants that are not from India. And then there's, like I said, there's a whole lot of political layering here that one must unpack before one gets into some of these questions. But, speaking specifically of women migrants, right, there are sort of the visible markers of access and the ability to navigate the city or, have safe public transport. These are all things that you can see and in a certain way even measure. Like, for example, did you get water, or did you get, your welfare benefit that you're eligible to? Do you have safe childcare? Do you have some job? Like, all of those things are fairly quantifiable, measurable, visible aspects of the migrant experience, and one can almost begin to say or link back to categories of migration, or you can begin to link back to who is coming and why these sort of services or access levels vary so much, right? So there's that aspect. But I think what's invisible, and I think that this is much more difficult to quantify or measure, is the sheer experience of being a female migrant or a migrant in this city, and the toll and the enormous toll that it takes on one's mental health, and consequently on, I guess, other aspects of one's health as well, which is that, no point of time are you secure. Very often migrants come into fairly insecure housing where you literally, the experience is that your house could be, uprooted soon. Just to sort of relate an experience during my field work, the word kayam, right? Kayam means permanent, or permanence in variety of languages. And one of the comments was, we were having a conversation, and then at some point of time he says, but we are never kayam. You could come back tomorrow and we might not exist. So finish your field work today. And I always sort of struggle to process that single moment in the fieldwork experience. But I also think that that invisible aspect of the migration experience, the having to navigate the city through insecure housing and insecure everything, is something that we need to talk a lot more about in talking about migration. And internal and external, I don't want to reduce them to categories, because there's a profound, in a certain way, different experience, I guess. But I think that, this invisible, mental, psychic, visceral sort of experience is something we need to talk a lot more about in the context of migration, overlaid by gender. Talking a little bit more about, what kind of response there should be, I think it's a harder question to answer. I think we need to unpack a little bit more about both the political economy and how that's the dynamics of it, because that is something that's changing as well as migration patterns change and evolve. They're also fairly geographically specific, so one must pay attention to that. And I think also a certain amount of visibility. Like I said, there are a fair amount of scholars. There's Aditi Suri at IIHS, there's Nupur Rawal, a bunch of people who are sort of working on thinking about gender, particularly platform work, and in a certain way migration. But I think having more robust visibility and empirical knowledge of how these experiences are, some of the quantifiable ones as well as some of the more sort of emotive ones, I think is very, very important for us to have a measured sort of policy response in this context.
Got it. No, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if I understand correctly, what I'm also taking away from this conversation is that while there is a lack of empirical data, there is also a certain sense that, like as you said, that I mean, something that I caught while you were talking earlier was that there is also a reliance of migrant workers on public infrastructure, robust transportation systems. And could you talk a little bit about how this affects? I mean, in the sense, I'm trying to understand, because I think some of the things that we take for granted, those of us who can navigate the city without having to rely specifically on public services, can, I think, become crucial or essential for someone who doesn't have those options, right? In a sense, I was just trying to understand, did you notice a specific, I mean, the importance of urban infrastructure itself in and around these communities, whether it's in the form of sanitation facilities, whether it's in the form of bus stops and bus services? In a sense, I'm just trying to understand what are the kinds of services that communities particularly rely on in navigating their work and their life in Bangalore.
Right, that's a super interesting question. I think sort of you've hit on something very fundamental here, right? What happens when the state is absent is that a private market creeps in, and it's fairly problematic and exploitative of the most vulnerable, right? So let's take, for example, water. In the absence of access to water, what ends up happening is that you rely on a private, like it's an intermediary is perhaps the word, who controls access to a pipe and a tap, and you would pay them 2 rupees or 5 rupees a pot of water each time you wanted to get access to water. Now imagine what that means, right? Water is something that's fundamental to human existence. This is something that the state should be providing, even if it's at that you have to pay for it. If it's metered and you sort of pay for how much you consume, even then it's something that the state should provide. Whereas now it's being served by a private market, and often very much in the realm of profiteering, very problematic, very exploitative relationships that exist in the context of access to basic urban infrastructure. And that's the same for water, for sanitation. You would have instances, particularly when during women's menstrual cycles, you would end up paying somebody to use their bathroom, a local person who has access to a bathroom. And so these private markets are something that replace the provision of state services. So that's one narrative to think about, and the way in which this interplay between basic services from the state versus the private markets that provide them in fairly problematic ways. Healthcare too are things that one pillar to contemplate. The second, I think, is one must also talk about some of the housing policy narratives in this context, because a lot of the housing policy narratives, and this is much keeps popping up, like these visions of a Singapore-like city, like clean India, slum-free Bangalore, those kinds of visions, which often involve displacing entire communities of slum dwellers and relocating them into the peripheries of the city where land is more freely available, and you can sort of have, or the state can invest in construction. While this is an important function in the sense that housing must be provided, it's more problematic because it's located in this idea that you can clean up the city, but also what it means for access to infrastructure in these peripheral areas, right? We know in most urban areas, peripheral parts of the city are more poorly connected to public transport, more poor, like a lower availability of job opportunities. So a lot of the contestation in a certain way happens around that, which is that communities don't want to move, but the state is trying to drive entire communities to shift to the peripheries with these notions of sort of a clean urban area or whatever else, right? And also, of course, land is a very precious commodity, particularly in the areas closer to the city. And so the temptation is often to displace migrant communities, the poor, in order to replace it with, some kind of fancy glitzy construction. So I think that there's both these pillars that inform the way in which this access is navigated, either the rise or the existence of private markets, and B, the way in which these housing policy kind of conversations happen, which sort of brings about or results in a fair amount of conflict in the context of housing. So I think, both of these are important to think about.
No, absolutely. Because when you were talking about it, I was just thinking about, what we learn in terms of when, at least in law school, when they taught us about even the Rehabilitation, the Resettlement Act and land acquisition. One of the things that I think a lot of us often fail to also consider, that it's not just resettlement of a community from one geographical location to the other, it's also the entire political economy of that space, right? The networks and the jobs and the opportunities that they have been able to make in the city, which is often, like, as you mentioned, there are more economic opportunities. And also, it's like, it's not just about shifting someone's home, it's about their entire life and the way that they've been going on to work and where they've been keeping their children for childcare. So there is like a series of networks of relationships that I think people have formed that are disrupted, right? And I think it's often something that doesn't quite enter into our own like consciousness in thinking about how violent this can be, this act of displacing people from where they live and have formed their life.
And there's this almost elitist assumption that, why wouldn't you move for a better house? But then your reason to stay in a particular place is not just, the physical aspect or just the house, but it's also a range of networks, it's the community, and what that means for your sense of identity or sense of well-being, as well as, your economic opportunities. Because if you don't have access to transportation and you don't have access to jobs, then there is, there's a challenge there. So I think that you're absolutely right in thinking that this is a violent process. And it often comes from a very problematic set of assumptions as well.
That concludes part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Sarayu Natarajan. In part 2 of the conversation, which will be released next week, we will talk about the platform economy, the specific challenges faced by women workers in the platform economy, the problems and challenges that are inbuilt into the platform economy itself, precarity, surveillance, and some of the ways in which law can address these questions. We also discuss political participation of women in cities. It's an extremely engaging conversation, and I hope you'll join us again next week. Readings that have been discussed today and concepts that have been touched upon in this conversation, you will find them on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you'll continue to catch these episodes. Thank you for staying with us, and I hope you have a nice day.